HOA burned down my house, but they didn't know I was a judge. The acrid stench of burning would choke the morning air as I stood paralyzed, watching my beloved Victorian home consumed by flames. A plume of black smoke clawed at the sky, mirroring the hollowness rapidly engulfing me. And there she was, Karen, my HOA neighbor, perched on her pristine lawn, a smug smile twisting her lips as she savored her victory. Her manicured hand trembled ever so slightly as she lifted her coffee cup, steam curling around her face like a taunt. She thought she'd finally won our war. Little did that venomous viper know that I was a federal judge, and I had the power to dismantle everything she'd meticulously constructed. The question wasn't if I would retaliate, but how far she'd push me before I unleashed the full force of my authority. Comment below where you're watching from, and let me know if you've ever dealt with a neighbor like Karen. The dawn had broken with the promise of a tranquil day. I was cradled in the familiar embrace of my grandmother's century-old porch swing, the scent of roses and damp earth filling my lungs as the sunrise painted the sky in strokes of fiery orange and gentle pink, illuminating the whimsical purple trim of our Victorian haven. That's when I saw her, Karen Abernathy, her silhouette a rigid line of malice, power walking towards my mailbox. An envelope was clutched in her manicured hands, held as if it contained the keys to the kingdom. I recognized that glint in her eyes, the same fanatical gleam she'd brandished during those excruciating neighborhood meetings she orchestrated at her newly renovated McMansion next door. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. She deposited the envelope with a deliberate thud, lingering to photograph my front yard with her phone, her lips pursed in disapproval. My grandmother's roses, a riot of color and fragrance, bloomed in defiant splendor, a stark contrast to Karen's sterile, geometrically perfect boxwood hedges. She loathed every unruly petal, every vibrant hue that dared to challenge her vision of suburban conformity. The envelope contained what she termed an exciting opportunity. A formal invitation to join their newly formed HOA, complete with a glossy brochure showcasing identical beige houses and soulless matching mailboxes. The membership fee was a staggering $5,000, with monthly dues of $350, but it wasn't the exorbitant cost that made my blood run cold. It was the mandatory property modifications list attached. Remove all non-approved paint colors, including my grandmother's beloved purple trim. Replace the heritage rose garden with approved vegetation. Take down the antique wind chimes that had sung me to sleep every night since childhood, their melodies woven into the very fabric of my being. I watched Karen through the lace curtains of my window as she retreated next door, phone pressed to her ear, her voice dripping with saccharine insincerity. Yes, I just delivered the final invitation. She has to join now. Her house is the last holdout on the street. The insidious sweetness in her tone made my skin crawl. Once we get her property in line, this neighborhood's value will skyrocket. That evening, I marched over to Karen's house, invitation clutched in my fist, its glossy surface crinkling with suppressed fury. Her doorbell chimed a nauseatingly cheerful rendition of "We Are the Champions." Of course it did. She answered, sporting a neighborhood watch captain badge like a badge of honor, her lips stretched into what she likely believed was a welcoming smile, but which read as a predatory sneer. "I've reviewed your invitation," I stated, my voice a carefully controlled weapon honed by years in the courtroom. "I need to decline. This house has been in my family for 3 generations, and I intend to preserve its historic character." Her smile vanished with the speed of a frightened rabbit. "You don't understand," she hissed, leaning forward conspiratorially. "This isn't an invitation. The HOA has already been registered. Your property is surrounded by HOA members. You have to join." I produced the meticulously researched property maps I'd unearthed that afternoon. "That's incorrect. My deed predates any HOA agreements, and I have no legal obligation to join. 20 years of legal battles had taught me to anticipate every angle, to weaponize knowledge itself." Karen's face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. "Listen here," she spat, abandoning all pretense of civility. "This neighborhood is changing. Progress is happening. If you don't get with the program, things might get difficult. Accidents happen to houses that don't meet code. Citations get filed. Fines add up." I met her gaze unflinchingly. "Is that a threat, Mrs. Abernathy?" She recoiled, the sugary smile returning with unnerving speed. "Of course not. I'm just concerned about your property values and safety. Old houses like yours can be so unpredictable. Electrical problems. Structural issues. It would be terrible if something happened because you refused to modernize. Behind her, I saw her husband watching from their window, a predatory gleam in his eyes, phone clutched in his hand. Something about his stance, his unnerving stillness, made me deeply uneasy. I nodded curtly and turned to leave, but Karen's voice, sharp and laced with venom, stopped me. 1 week, she called after me, her voice echoing in the twilight. You have 1 week to reconsider before the HOA board meets to discuss enforcement options. As I walked home, the oppressive weight of her words suffocating me, I noticed the new faces peering from behind curtained windows. Karen's HOA allies, no doubt. Something deep inside me screamed that this wouldn't end with a simple declined invitation. I spent that night installing high-definition security cameras around my property, meticulously documenting its current condition. I'd learned long ago to trust my instincts, and right now, they were screaming that Karen Abernathy was just getting started. What I didn't know then was that this wasn't just about property values or purple trim. In my 3 decades of navigating the treacherous waters of human conflict, I'd never encountered anyone quite like Karen. As I drifted to sleep to the gentle symphony of my grandmother's wind chimes, I had no idea that this was just the overture to a war that would change everything, and that my beloved Victorian home would become its first casualty. But Karen had made one crucial, fatal mistake in choosing her target. She just didn't know it yet. The morning dawned with Karen's shrill voice piercing the quiet. Look at those hideous purple trims. They're destroying our property values. I peeked through my curtains to find her leading a posse of HOA members on what they pompously called their morning inspection. My heart sank as I watched them swarm over my property, their phones flashing like weapons, documenting every inch of my grandmother's beloved home with a palpable sense of glee. I tried to salvage some semblance of peace by sipping my morning coffee on the porch, but their whispered barbs carried across the lawn like poisoned darts. Did you see those ancient wind chimes? They're so not HOA approved. And those roses. They're 3 inches taller than regulation. Every day brought new, increasingly absurd complaints. Bright orange warning letters, plastered to my door like scarlet letters, listed violations that didn't exist before their reign of terror. My heritage rose garden, a testament to my grandmother's green thumb and a haven for local bees, was suddenly deemed a neighborhood nuisance. The authentic Victorian purple trim, once admired by tourists and local artists, became their primary target of vitriol. One Tuesday morning, I found Karen measuring my grass with a ruler, her face a mask of triumphant vindictiveness. 11.5 inches, she announced to her sycophantic sidekick, Catherine, who furiously scribbled in a notebook. That's 3.5 inches over code. I walked out calmly, coffee mug in hand, the legal armor I wore daily shielding me from the worst of her venom. You're trespassing on private property, I stated firmly, knowing my legal rights but carefully concealing my true profession. Karen just smirked, snapping more photos with her phone. The harassment escalated into creative torment. They scheduled landscapers to arrive at precisely 7 a.m. on Saturdays, their ear-splitting equipment conveniently positioned directly beneath my bedroom window. Anonymous complaints to code enforcement became a weekly ritual, each time requiring me to calmly present my property's historic status documentation, all while watching Karen fume from behind her pristine window panes. They even resorted to psychological warfare. Karen organized HOA meetings in her driveway, right outside my home office, ensuring I could hear their venomous pronouncements about how some people were dragging down the neighborhood's reputation, how certain houses needed to be dealt with for the greater good. My security cameras documented their increasingly brazen antics. They let their dogs use my yard as a toilet, then feigned shock when I presented them with the damning footage. "Oh, my precious Bentley would never!" Karen would gasp, clutching her faux pearls, while her monstrous golden doodle left another present on my lawn. The breaking point arrived during their annual block party. I wasn't invited, of course, but I could hear Karen's amplified voice, laced with malice, discussing plans to revitalize the neighborhood. Some older properties, she announced, her eyes deliberately fixed on my house, just don't fit our community vision anymore. That's when I noticed people surreptitiously photographing my home's foundation, whispering about structural concerns. I remained outwardly calm, meticulously documenting everything, each letter, every photo, all the anonymous complaints, filed methodically in my growing dossier. When they installed blinding security lights aimed directly at my bedroom windows, I added light pollution to my burgeoning evidence file. My grandmother had instilled in me the virtue of patience, and as I watched Karen's group grow bolder, I knew that timing would be everything. That night, reviewing my security footage, I uncovered something deeply disturbing. 2 HOA board members were examining my property line markers, whispering about easement regulations. I recognized that predatory gleam in their eyes. They were planning something bigger, something more insidious. But what? They didn't know that I'd spent my career battling individuals who believed themselves to be above the law. As I switched off my porch light, watching Karen's group huddle in her driveway like a coven of witches, I wondered how much longer I should wait before revealing exactly who they were truly dealing with. I never anticipated discovering Karen and 2 other HOA board members skulking around my property at midnight, their faces illuminated by the cold glare of my kitchen light as I got up for a glass of water. My heart lurched as I saw the chemical sprayers clutched in their gloved hands, pointed directly at my grandmother's century-old rose garden. "What do you think you're doing?" I called out from my porch, my voice a low growl, phone already recording. Karen jumped, startled, but quickly regained her composure, that poisonous smile spreading across her face. "Oh, we're just helping to eliminate these invasive species," she said sweetly, continuing to douse my roses in the noxious spray. "The HOA has strict rules about non-native plants. If you just join us, we could handle these issues properly." I walked closer, my blood simmering, but my voice remaining deceptively steady. "Those aren't invasive species, Karen. They're heritage Victorian roses, planted by my grandmother in 1960. I have the original documentation and Gardening Society registration." The other board members shifted uncomfortably, but Karen stood her ground, her eyes glittering with manic intensity. "Well, someone complained about the smell," she sniffed, adjusting her designer pajamas. "And these thorns are a safety hazard for children. Walking by on my private property, behind my fence?" I challenged, switching on my security lights, the sudden illumination transforming the scene into a stark tableau of malice and defiance. "The property line is marked, and you're trespassing." That's when Bob, Karen's husband, emerged from the shadows, his presence radiating a menacing aura. As a retired police sergeant, he likely believed he could intimidate anyone. Now, let's not throw around accusations," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We're just trying to maintain neighborhood standards. Nobody wants to live next to a jungle." I noticed Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor across the street, peeking through her curtains, her face etched with fear. She'd been bullied into joining the HOA the previous month, after similar late-night visits. Her beautiful rock garden had been replaced with Karen-approved generic shrubs within days. The next morning, my roses were dead, their once vibrant petals blackened and withered, their fragrance replaced by the acrid stench of poison. But Karen had committed a critical blunder. She'd unknowingly revealed the HOA's systematic pattern of targeting specific homeowners. I dedicated my lunch break to poring over records at the county records office, discovering that every house that initially refused to join the HOA had experienced a string of mysterious accidents or code violations until they succumbed and sold. I installed even more sophisticated, high-definition security cameras that afternoon, camouflaging them meticulously among my remaining plants. That evening, Karen paraded a group of potential buyers past my property, her voice amplified to ensure I could hear every word. "Of course, this eyesore will be dealt with soon," she announced loudly, her gaze locking with mine. "We have ways of handling difficult residents." The following week brought an unrelenting barrage of harassment. My mailbox was repeatedly smashed, anonymous complaints were filed about noise on days I wasn't even home, and code enforcement officers appeared daily, finding nothing, yet returning anyway. My garbage bins mysteriously vanished, only to reappear bearing glaring violations of HOA rules. I documented everything meticulously, building my case brick by brick, quietly and relentlessly. Karen's group, emboldened by their apparent impunity, grew increasingly brazen. They began hosting HOA meetings directly in front of my house, loudly pointing out every perceived flaw to prospective new residents. "This property is driving down home values," Karen would declare, waving her designer handbag for emphasis. "But don't worry, it won't be a problem for much longer." The final straw was drawn when I caught them tampering with my historic fence posts, carefully loosening them while pretending to measure the sidewalk. My security cameras captured Karen issuing explicit instructions to her minions. "Once these posts fail inspection, she'll have to replace the whole fence with our approved model. That'll cost her thousands, unless she joins the HOA, of course." That night, as I reviewed the footage, I noticed something truly chilling. The HOA's inspection team invariably included someone discreetly photographing my electrical boxes, gas lines, and other utilities. They were methodically documenting every potential vulnerability of my home. But why? The pieces were finally falling into place, and the picture they formed sent a glacial wave of dread cascading through my veins. I knew I needed to act, and to act swiftly, but I couldn't reveal my hand prematurely. What I didn't know then was that Karen had already set in motion a plan, a cataclysmic plan, that would unleash all my darkest fears. My hands trembled as I read the morning paper, the headline screaming in bold letters: "Federal Judge Sentences Corrupt CEO to Prison." The courtroom had been eerily silent as my clerk, Chloe, burst through the doors, her face ashen, and uttered 5 words that would forever alter the course of my life. "Your Honor, your house, it's on fire!" Those words detonated in my mind, sending shockwaves of ice and fire through my veins. I ripped off my black robes, the weight of justice feeling suddenly unbearable, and raced down the courthouse steps, my heart hammering against my ribs like a frantic bird. 15 minutes. That's all it took to reach my neighborhood, but the agonizing journey felt like an eternity. Even 3 blocks away, I could see the ominous plume of black smoke billowing into the sky, a harbinger of the devastation that awaited me. My stomach churned, a cold knot of dread twisting tighter with each passing second. I screeched to a halt in front of my burning home. Firefighters were already battling the inferno, their valiant efforts dwarfed by the ravenous flames that had engulfed my past. The heat hit me like a physical blow, the stench of burning wood and melting plastic searing my nostrils. I could hear the ancient wooden beams groaning in agony under the relentless assault of the fire, a symphony of destruction that echoed the unraveling of my world. Everything my family had painstakingly built over 3 generations, every memory etched into the walls of that house, was being devoured before my eyes. Through the blinding tears that streamed down my face, I spotted her. Karen, standing in her driveway, clad in her obscenely expensive designer yoga pants, sipping her obscenely overpriced coffee, watching the inferno with an expression of chilling satisfaction. Her perfectly styled blonde hair gleamed in the sunlight, untouched by the smoke and ash that filled the air. She chatted animatedly with the other HOA board members, their voices hushed and gleeful, not even bothering to conceal their triumph, pointing at different parts of my burning home with a morbid curiosity. Fire Chief Reynolds approached me, his face grim, streaked with soot and exhaustion. "Ma'am, it looks like an electrical fire. These old houses, their wiring can be dangerous." But I knew better. Just yesterday, I'd had my annual electrical inspection. Everything was up to code, meticulously maintained, just as it had always been. I'd insured it, specifically, after Karen's thinly veiled threats about unsafe historic properties at that rancorous town meeting. My security cameras. The realization struck me like a physical blow. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I tried to access the footage. The screen remained stubbornly blank. The cameras had mysteriously stopped recording at 3 a.m. precisely 4 hours before the fire erupted. This was no coincidence. This was a carefully orchestrated act of calculated malice. As I watched my home being reduced to ash, memories flooded my mind, sharp and poignant. Learning to bake cookies in that cozy kitchen with Grandma, celebrating my law school graduation with champagne toasts in the fragrant garden, my investiture ceremony, the proudest moment of my career, all going up in smoke. I wouldn't bow to Karen's petty demands because I refused to surrender my heritage to her twisted vision of suburban perfection. Through the throng of onlookers, I recognized 2 familiar faces, Bob Jenkins and Mike Peters, both notorious HOA board members, attempting to blend in with the gathering crowd of neighbors. But their footwear betrayed them. They were wearing the same distinctive work boots I'd seen on my security footage last week, the same boots that had been present when my precious rose bushes were vandalized. Now those boots were caked in what looked suspiciously like fresh mud, or was it ash? Karen sauntered over, her face contorted into a grotesque mask of faux concern. "Oh, this is just terrible!" she exclaimed, her voice dripping with insincerity. "If only you joined our HOA, we have such strict safety requirements. But you were so stubborn about keeping things historic." She emphasized the last word as if it were a curse. She took another deliberate sip of her coffee, her eyes locking with mine, a silent taunt that screamed of victory. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood, forcing myself to maintain a semblance of composure. Not yet. I couldn't reveal my hand yet. Instead, I watched as she pulled out her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen as she composed the message. Moments later, I overheard another neighbor excitedly discussing a fantastic deal on premium land that had just been listed in some exclusive real estate group. The fire department eventually brought the blaze under control, but it was too late. The exquisite Victorian windows were shattered, the hand-carved porch railings were charred beyond recognition, and the roof had partially collapsed. A century of history, a lifetime of memories, obliterated in a matter of hours. As I stood there, amidst the smoldering ruins, watching the smoke ascend into the morning sky like the ghosts of my past, I made a decision. Karen believed she'd triumphed, believed she'd broken me. But she just made the most colossal, catastrophic mistake of her life. I pulled out my phone and placed 3 phone calls, one to my trusted friend at the FBI, one to my equally trusted contact at the state attorney's office, and one to a private investigator I knew would move heaven and earth to uncover the truth. I caught Karen watching me make those calls, a flicker of uncertainty momentarily flitting across her smug facade. She didn't know to whom I was speaking, but something in my unwavering resolve, my steely gaze, must have unsettled her. Good. Let her worry. Because while my house lay in ruins, my true power had nothing to do with property, and everything to do with justice. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the wreckage, I picked up a small, charred fragment of the purple trim, its color muted by the ash. Grandma had always said that sometimes, you have to lose everything to gain the strength to fight back. Looking at Karen's smug, self-satisfied face one last time, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. But first, I had to understand the full, terrifying depth of the HOA's corruption. Standing in the ashes of my grandmother's home, I made a solemn promise, a vow that transformed my grief into a relentless, burning purpose. While Karen paraded around the neighborhood, gleefully spreading rumors that I'd deliberately burned my own house for insurance money, I was quietly, meticulously pulling at the threads that would unravel her entire empire. My first breakthrough arrived when my old law school buddy, now a seasoned real estate investigator, unearthed a startling anomaly. Every house that had mysteriously burned in our county over the past 5 years had been sold to the same shadowy shell company, a company owned by none other than Karen's sister-in-law. I felt my hands tremble as I delved deeper into the property records, each page revealing a pattern far too perfect to be mere coincidence. I hired a private investigator who began interviewing former neighbors who had lost their homes, their stories chillingly mirroring my own. Join the HOA or face escalating harassment, culminating in suspicious accidents or fires. Most had caved, selling their homes for a pittance to Karen's investment group. One elderly man broke down sobbing as he described losing his irreplaceable family photos in a suspicious garage fire the day after he defiantly refused to join the HOA. The next pivotal piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, Karen's former assistant treasurer, who reached out through my lawyer, her voice trembling with fear and remorse. We met at a quiet diner 2 towns over, the windows fogged with condensation, the air thick with unspoken dread. She handed me a USB drive containing 5 years of meticulously manipulated HOA financial records. Her hands shook as she recounted how Karen had coerced her into falsifying the books, threatening to expose her undocumented status if she refused. The documents revealed hundreds of thousands of dollars in untraceable cash deposits, made immediately following each accidental fire. I spent sleepless nights connecting the dots, piecing together the intricate web of deceit. Karen's husband hadn't simply retired from the police force. He'd been the fire investigator responsible for ruling every suspicious fire in their territory an accident, effectively shielding the perpetrators from scrutiny. The insurance companies had paid out millions based on his deliberately negligent reports. My security cameras had captured more than just the arsonists. They'd recorded weekly meetings at Karen's house with a cabal of avaricious real estate developers, all salivating over plans to construct luxury condominiums on the sites of our historic homes. One developer had even bragged openly about bribing city officials to manipulate zoning laws once enough properties had been acquired. I discovered Karen's insidious modus operandi: target homes in prime locations, particularly historic properties that couldn't be easily replicated. She'd leverage HOA rules to unleash a relentless campaign of harassment, escalating to vandalism and blatant threats. If those tactics failed to break the homeowner's spirit, mysterious accidents would invariably follow. Her group would then swoop in to help the distressed homeowners, buying their properties for a fraction of their true market value. Working late into the night, my eyes burning with exhaustion, I uncovered the smoking gun in a dusty corner of the old county records office. Karen had executed this precise scheme before, devastating 3 other historic neighborhoods in neighboring counties. She'd move in, establish HOA, systematically drive out resistant homeowners, then sell the consolidated properties to developers for an exorbitant profit. She'd even received community service awards for her supposed neighborhood improvement efforts. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, but I needed irrefutable proof. I convinced the FBI to wire up the former treasurer for a clandestine meeting with Karen. The surreptitious recording captured everything. Karen brazenly bragging about their next targets, casually joking about which houses might conveniently develop electrical problems, and threatening to make the treasurer disappear if she ever dared to reveal their secrets. Each day, I observed Karen strutting around the neighborhood, orchestrating her next malevolent move, completely oblivious to the fact that every smug wave, every fake expression of sympathy about my tragic accident, was being meticulously documented. Her arrogance, her unwavering belief in her impunity, would prove to be her ultimate downfall. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place when I discovered the real reason why she had singled out my house for destruction. Hidden deep within the city archives was a faded, forgotten map depicting a planned highway expansion. Karen's developer cronies possessed inside information. My property was the linchpin to their grand design for a sprawling new shopping complex. They had already acquired the surrounding land through their network of shell companies, but my house stood as an insurmountable obstacle. Without it, their entire multi-million-dollar project would crumble. As I organized a mountain of evidence for the FBI, Karen's desperation grew increasingly palpable. She filed a barrage of frivolous complaints about my unsightly property, now just a charred shell of its former glory. She even dared to propose a special HOA assessment to clean up my lot, funds that would, of course, flow directly into her already overflowing coffers. Little did she realize that every move she made, every petty act of vindictiveness, only served to strengthen the case against her. I stood outside the community center, my heart pounding a frantic tattoo against my ribs, watching Karen glide through the entrance, clutching her signature coffee mug and a stack of papers. Tonight's HOA meeting would be unlike any other. After 6 months of meticulous planning, I would finally reveal to her, and the entire world, exactly who she had been foolish enough to cross. Through the window, I could see her meticulously setting up her PowerPoint presentation, undoubtedly filled with more fabricated violation photos and fabricated rules. My hands trembled slightly as I reached into my briefcase, touching the reassuring weight of my judicial robes, neatly folded inside. The presence of the FBI wire concealed beneath my blazer served as a stark reminder that everything, absolutely everything, had to unfold with unwavering precision. The property at 247 Maple Street has been declared a public nuisance. Karen's amplified voice boomed through the room as I quietly pushed open the door. As per our emergency powers, we will be moving forward with immediate redevelopment plans. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the room. My neighbors, the decent ones who had been too intimidated to confront her, shifted uncomfortably in their cheap plastic chairs. Any objections? Karen smirked, her gaze sweeping the room, a predator surveying its prey. No? Well then, let me unveil our exciting plans for... I object, Mrs. Abernathy. My voice sliced through the suffocating tension like a razor-sharp blade. Every head swiveled towards the entrance, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels clicking deliberately against the linoleum floor, the sound echoing like the approaching hammer of justice. Karen's smugness faltered for a fleeting moment, but she quickly recovered, her eyes narrowing with thinly veiled hostility. Well, well! Come to finally admit defeat? Your burnout wreck of a house is quite the eyesore. We're doing you a favor. She took a long, ostentatious sip from her coffee mug, the same mug she had clutched while watching my home burn, the same smug smile plastered across her face. I reached into my briefcase, extracting a thick folder and spreading its contents across the table, revealing a series of damning photographs. I'm here to present some evidence of my own. These security cameras clearly show you and your board members trespassing on my property the night of the fire. Interesting timing, don't you think? Karen's face twitched, her composure beginning to fray. Those could be anyone. And besides, you can't prove. Oh, but I can. I interjected, pulling out additional documents. Bank records detailing a series of mysterious payments to your shell company after each distressed property sale. emails outlining your meticulously crafted plans to force out non-HOA members. And my personal favorite," I added, my voice dripping with sarcasm, "your text messages about ensuring that the electrical fire appeared accidental." The room erupted in a chorus of gasps and horrified whispers. Karen's hands began to tremble uncontrollably, the coffee sloshing over the rim of her mug, staining her pristine white suit. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "You can't just waltz in here with these wild accusations. I'll sue you for defamation." That was my cue. I reached back into my briefcase one final time, pulling out my judicial robes. The silk fabric unfurled with a dramatic flourish as I slipped them on, the weight of justice settling upon my shoulders. "Federal Judge Sarah Reynolds," I announced, watching the color drain from Karen's face, "currently presiding over case number 2025, County Route 142, United States v. Abernathy et al., a RICO investigation into corruption, fraud, and criminal conspiracy." Her coffee mug slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor with a resounding crash, the hot liquid splashing across her designer shoes. But she didn't even register the sensation. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, her eyes wide with dawning horror. "FBI." The command ripped through the room, sharp and decisive. Agents flooded in through both entrances, badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. Karen's husband, the retired police sergeant who had buried all those inconvenient police reports, attempted to make a desperate dash for the emergency exit. He didn't make it 3 steps before being tackled and subdued. I walked slowly towards Karen, who had collapsed into her precious president's chair, her face a mask of abject terror. "You know what the biggest mistake criminals make?" I asked, my voice low and unwavering. "They get so caught up in their power, they forget to check who they're dealing with." I picked up her fallen gavel, the instrument she had used to sentence my home to destruction. Meeting adjourned. The sharp, decisive click of handcuffs echoed through the room as the FBI led Karen and her board members away, their reign of terror finally brought to an ignominious end. My neighbors erupted in thunderous applause, years of pent-up fear and intimidation finally shattered. As I gathered my evidence, old Mrs. Jenkins from across the street embraced me, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "We should have helped you fight them," she sobbed. I hugged her back, watching as Karen was escorted to a waiting police car, her face contorted with rage and disbelief. "Sometimes," I said quietly, "justice needs to take the long road to ensure it arrives at the right destination." The morning of the trial felt different, charged with a sense of anticipation. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, straightening my judge's robe, remembering how Karen had laughed while my house burned. Now she wasn't laughing. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, reporters, and victims from other neighborhoods who had bravely come forward after seeing our story on the local news. Karen entered the courtroom, wearing an expensive suit instead of her usual athleisure wear, but her face turned ghostly white when she saw me sitting on the bench, my gaze unwavering. I'll never forget the look of absolute dread on her face as she grabbed her lawyer's arm and whispered, her voice barely audible, "That's her, the one whose house we burned." Her lawyer dropped his pen in stunned silence. The evidence we presented was both shocking and irrefutable. Our investigation had uncovered 15 other houses that had mysteriously caught fire after their owners refused to join Karen's HOA. The pattern was always the same, a relentless campaign of harassment, escalating vandalism, and ultimately arson. They would then purchase the fire-damaged properties for a pittance through the shell company owned by Karen's brother-in-law, raking in millions in ill-gotten gains. We played this security footage from my cameras, capturing Karen and her HOA cohorts gleefully spreading gasoline around my grandmother's rose bushes at 2 a.m. The entire courtroom gasped as Karen's voice crackled through the speakers. "Once it burns, she'll have to sell." The real bombshell exploded when Karen's husband, the disgraced retired police sergeant, turned against her, his conscience finally overcoming his loyalty. He confessed everything, detailing how they had planned each fire with meticulous precision, how they had selected their targets, and how they had bribed local officials to turn a blind eye. Karen screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. "Liar!" The FBI had to forcibly remove her from the courtroom. One by one, people rose to share their stories of intimidation and loss. Mrs. Rodriguez, the retired teacher who lost her irreplaceable family photos. The Cowrie family, whose grandfather's ashes had been destroyed in a suspicious fire. Each testimony chipped away at Karen's carefully constructed facade, revealing the cruel, avaricious monster that lurked beneath. Her designer suit could no longer conceal the abject terror in her eyes. When I read the verdict, my voice did not waver, my hand did not tremble. 25 years for Karen Abernathy. 15 years for each of her co-conspirators. Their faces mirrored a dawning realization. No amount of money, no amount of influence, could shield them from the long arm of justice. Karen attempted to deliver a rambling, self-serving speech about how she had only been trying to protect property values. But I silenced her, cutting her off with the same cold indifference she had shown when I tried to explain the significance of my grandmother's roses. That is enough, Mrs. Abernathy. That was 6 months ago. Today, I stood in my rose garden, watching the construction crew put the final touches on my rebuilt Victorian home. The purple trim was the same shade that Grandma had so lovingly mixed. The rose garden was bursting back to life, propagated from cuttings taken from the one surviving bush. Karen's house had been seized by the authorities and sold to pay victim compensation. A lovely immigrant family now lived there, their children laughing and playing in the yard where Karen used to stand, snapping photos of my alleged violations. The new neighbors had formed a genuine community association, not a tyrannical HOA, but a group that actively supports and helps each other. We have block parties in my garden, everyone bringing food and sharing stories, forging bonds of friendship that Karen could never have comprehended. Yesterday, Mrs. Rodriguez brought her famous empanadas and proudly displayed the restored family photos her daughter had painstakingly pieced back together from the damaged albums. Sometimes, when I'm working in my garden, people stop to thank me, not for being a judge, but for standing up to the bullies, for refusing to surrender to fear. The local news ran a follow-up story about our neighborhood, chronicling its transformation from a community terrorized by Karen into a thriving haven of friendship and mutual support. They interviewed the Cowrie family, who now host our monthly meetings in their beautifully landscaped backyard, their laughter echoing through the evening air. I keep Karen's shattered coffee cup on my desk at the courthouse, a stark reminder that justice may be slow, but it is ultimately inevitable. Just like my grandmother always said. And every morning, I sip my coffee in my rose garden, watching the sunrise paint the sky through my perfectly purple-trimmed windows, knowing that sometimes, the best revenge is simply rebuilding something more beautiful, more vibrant, and more enduring than what was destroyed.